We are going to finish out our study of Jonah, and we'll be looking at the 4th chapter and 2 sessions for that, but we're in the book of Jonah, and this is Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia, or BHS, and we go down to chapter 4. It's down here, and I'm going to be looking at it in a more magnified fashion with the lines more separated so we have some space, but we are looking at BHS. So here is Jonah chapter 4, and I'm going to start reading at verse 1, relatively short verse. So I'll go ahead and read that. Vayera el Yonah ra'ah gedolah, vayichar lo. So we start out here with a kal, and this is a vayiktal form. Again, because I have been doing it up till now, I am pronouncing the vavs with a V sound. That's how I've been pronouncing them for the past 3 chapters. So it's a kal, I'll call it vav consecutive, imperfect, and it is 3rd masculine singular. And the root is ra'ah. It's a geminate root. Oftentimes with geminate roots, when you have a vav consecutive, that second geminate consonant drops off. Notice also that you would expect a heuric for that prefix vowel, but with a vav consecutive, you'd expect there to be doubling here for a non-guttural, but that resh rejects the doubling, and so this lengthens the vowel before it. So we have vayera rather than vayira. The verb itself means to be evil, to be displeasing, and so it's followed by El Yonah, to Jonah. So it was evil to Jonah. And then we have this interesting construction here. You've got Ra'ah Gedolah. Ra'ah is the noun for evil. And then we have Gedolah, great. And so literally it was evil to Jonah, an evil great, or a great evil. And I think a lot of the translations would just say, and it was greatly displeasing to Jonah. Well, what was greatly displeasing to Jonah? Well, in the previous chapter, we learned that God relented from destroying Nineveh because Nineveh repented. And so it said God then held back from destroying them. And this ends up displeasing Jonah greatly. And then finally we read, Vayichar lo. Literally, and it was hot to him. So we have the root here, chara, to be hot or to be angry, and lo, just the preposition plus the pronominal suffix, 3rd masculine singular. So it was hot to him, and it was hot to him. Notice again, we also have the receded accent here. So it's vayichar, which is very typical for a vav consecutive. I didn't mention this is a vav consecutive, imperfect, 3rd masculine singular, and it's a kal. So we have the vayichar lo, and it was hot to him. So we would say, and it was evil to Jonah, a great evil, and it was hot to him, or, and Jonah was exceedingly displeased, and he became angry, or he was angry. Now let's take a look at verse 2. Verse 2 is actually pretty long. So I'm going to read the whole thing, and we'll go through it then in pieces. Vayit palel el Adonai, down to the next line, Vayomer ana Adonai, halo ze divari ad heyoti al admati, al kain, down to the next line, Kidamti livroach Tarshisha, ki yadati ki ata el chanun v'rachum erek, down to the next line, apayim urav chesed v'necham al hara'ah. This is actually a very full description of the attributes of God, an echo back from Exodus chapter 34, but Jonah is expressing them in a negative fashion. It's like, God, you're too compassionate. I knew you were going to be compassionate. Anyway, let's go back through this. So, Vayit Palel, this is a Vav consecutive. It's a Hitpael and a Vav consecutive imperfect. And so it's from the root Palal, which means to pray. And he prayed, El Adonai, to the Lord. Vayomer, and he said, so we can put our quotation marks here. This is what he said. Ana Adonai, please, Lord, or perhaps, I pray, Lord. Hello, this is our typical is not. And so, hello zeh, is not this? And then, divari, my word, is this not my word? Ad heyoti, this is haya, by the way. And a Cal perfect first common singular of haya. So ad hayoti, and ad has got a number of uses. It can mean until, it can mean while, and in this case it probably means while I was. Al adamti, upon my land or in my land, meaning back home. So is not this my word when I was on my home ground, I guess, my adamti, in my land? Therefore, alkane, common, very common phrase, alkane. We come down to the next line. Let me just first write in, this is a Cal perfect 3ms of haya. We'll come down here then to the next line. We've got kedamti, and this is a piel, and it comes from the root kadam, which normally means to be in front of or to meet, to go to someone, to go up to someone. Interestingly, here it says it seems to be kind of an unusual usage of the word. He's pairing it up with this following word here, which is an infinitive construct with a lamed preposition from the root barach, which means to flee. The idea is, therefore, I was quick to flee, or I went to flee to Tarshish, Tarshisha, as the accent recedes when you've got a directional hey at the end. So it's Tarshish is the place, and then Tarshisha. You put that directional hey at the end, and that then causes the accent not to go to the end. So Tarshisha, to Tarshish. So therefore I was forward to flee, perhaps, to Tarshish. Now, the next part of this is very interesting because he's now reciting to God God's own characteristics, which are actually positive characteristics, but they've made Jonah mad because God has shown mercy on the Ninevites. So he now explains why he ran away. So ki yadati, for I knew, this is just yada with a first common singular ending on it. So it's Cal perfect, first common singular. And then ki ata, for I knew that. Notice the ki is being used in two different ways here, ki and ki. For I knew that. Nothing unusual about that. For I knew that ata, you, and then we're going to supply the word are here. You are a God. You are a God, chanun, gracious, rachum, and merciful, erek, long, apayim, long of nose, apayim, meaning slow to anger, varav chesed, abounding in loving kindness or loyal love. And finally, vinecham, so relenting. It's the same root that we get repent from, and relenting concerning the evil, meaning the evil that he was, in this case, planning to do to Nineveh if they didn't repent. So it's very interesting here. This is echoing in a lot of ways Exodus 34, 6 and 7. And in that case, it's God proclaiming his attributes in Exodus 34, 6 and 7 to Moses. Here, Jonah is saying, hey, I knew that you had all these attributes, and that's why I fled, because I knew that you could be merciful to the Ninevites, and I didn't want you to be merciful to the Ninevites, is the clear implication here. So let's go back through this verse. So verse 2, and he prayed, Jonah prayed to the Lord, and he said, I pray, or please, Lord, is not this my word while I was upon my land, or in my land? Therefore, I went to flee, literally met to flee, or perhaps hastened to flee, to Tarshish. For I knew that you are a God, gracious and compassionate, or merciful, slow to anger, long of nose, and abounding in loving kindness, and relenting concerning the evil. Okay, before we go on, let's take a look at this verb right here, Nacham. That is a Nif'al participle, masculine singular. Let's do a quick sidebar on Nif'al participles, focusing on I-Nun verbs. But first, let's look at strong verbs. So a typical strong verb is pakad, to visit or to punish. And the Nif'al participle is nifkad, the masculine singular Nif'al participle. We'll be looking at masculine singular participles throughout, so that'll be the default. So notice we have the typical nun prefix with a heric prefix vowel, which is characteristic of Nif'al, and then we have the silent schwa under the pei, the root one letter, and then we have this comets here as the theme vowel. And for Nif'al participles, this comets is diagnostic for a Nif'al participle. It's actually quite handy for identifying this form. So we have nifkad. So as a verbal, this would pick up its meaning from the context. We could have was visited, or depending on the context, is visited or will be visited. This is a passive meaning. So the pakad has a kal, which is an active meaning, and the nifal for pakad is a passive meaning. And then we have either was visited or was being visited, is being visited, will be being visited. That's a little bit awkward, but The tense of the participle depends on context, whether it's past, present, or future. Now, if this is being used as a substantive rather than as a verbal, so as a substantive adjective, we would translate it as one who is visited. That passive idea in the Nif'al, perhaps one who was visited, one who will be visited, but this is probably the normal one who is visited, one visiting, something along those lines. So this is the strong verb. Now let's move on to the one noon verb for Nif'al participles. And so we'll look at the root nagash, that's a typical one noon. And here is the Nif'al participle, masculine singular, for nagash. And this is derived from the fact that you would have a noon prefix and then the noon root one letter, but instead of that, the first noon is swallowed up and becomes indicated by a dagesh forte. So it becomes nigash. Notice the same comets there as the theme vowel. So this would be, the idea is verbal, approach, approaching. It could be past tense, approached, will approach. Again, that depends on context. For the root nagash, the Nif'al meaning is active. And actually, the perfects and participles show up in Nif'al, but the other forms show up in Kal, and they're all active meaning. And the substantive adjective here would be one who approaches of the Nif'al. Now notice that the Nif'al perfect, third masculine singular, is nagash, and that has a patach, whereas the Nif'al participle is nagash with a comets. So it's one way to differentiate between those two. They look very similar, and the Nif'al perfect, third masculine singular, also swallows up that first noon root letter and turns it into a dagesh forte, as does the Nif'al participle, but the theme vowel is different. So that's a handy way to tell those two apart. All right, so we come down now to the root that we've been looking at, Nacham, but not only is it one noon, but it's also II-Guttural. And so that's going to cause some extra complications. So over here on the left is the Nif'al participle, masculine singular. But note that unlike nagash, there's no dagesh forte in this second root letter because it is a II-Guttural. And that chet cannot take a dagesh forte. So that takes away a very nice diagnostic that we normally have for a Nif'al participle, which is that dagesh forte. Note that the vowel is still a comets, and that's helpful. Verbally, the root Nacham is active in the Nif'al, and so verbally this would be relent, relents, will relent, possibly regret or repent. It can take different meanings in different contexts. It could perhaps also mean relenting, depending on how it's being used. On the substantive side, it would be one who relents. So it's still that active meaning in the Nif'al. Now, one possible point of confusion is that the Nif'al perfect third masculine singular looks very similar. It's Nacham with a patach, or it's Nacham with a comets. And of course, the second one is identical to the Nif'al participle. So that's one that, if that occurs, you just have to look at context and figure out what's going on. So this first one shows up in a number of places. 2 Samuel 13 is one, Amos chapter 7 is another. The second form, Nacham, sometimes also occurs. Now, it's often pausal, and in a pausal form, we expect the vowel to lengthen. But as often happens with Hebrew, there are exceptions. And so over in Judges 21:15, there's a case where this form shows up with the comets, but it's not pausal. So here's a case where you have two identical forms, and that happens occasionally with weak verbs. You just have identical forms. You have to figure it out. Not a big deal. So that's a quick review of the Nif'al participle for one noon and for this interesting case where we have a one noon and a II-Guttural. All right, let's move on to verse 3 now. V'ata Adonai kachna et nafshi. And down here, memeni ki tov moti mechayai. Okay, well, Jonah's not feeling too good about life at the moment. All right, so we have, and now, Lord. So the continuation of his speech now. And now, Lord, take please, at least he remembered to say please, he's talking to God. Take now, or take please, et nafshi, my life. Take my life. Mimeni, from me. Now, let's go look at a few verbs here. You've got a cal imperative right here of lakach. So lakach, and lakach acts like a weak verb. It actually acts like a one yod verb, and it drops that lamed. So it ends up looking like this in its imperative, just a cal imperative. And then na is this particle of entreaty. And then we have our direct object marker, and then nafshi, this nephesh with a pronominal suffix, first common singular. So my soul, or my life. Take now my life. Then we come down here, memeni, from me. So this is min, the preposition min, and then when you add a pronominal suffix on it, it kind of gets a little bit funky and mixed up, and it becomes memeni. And then for, so from me, for good, or better in this case, we'll see in context, good, moti, my death, from my life. And this min preposition here is often used in comparison. So when you use a tov and then the min preposition with a couple of things being compared, it becomes better. So better is my death from my life, or than my life. So mot plus a pronominal suffix, and then chai plus a pronominal suffix becomes chayai. For better, or for good or better, is my death than my life. Now the Masoretic text puts a break here, but just for the sake of splitting this up a little bit more evenly, I'm going to also cover verse 4 in this session. So let's take a look at verse 4. Vayomer Adonai, Hahitev Chara Lach. All right, pretty short verse here. So Vayomer Adonai, this is our very common Vav consecutive third masculine singular of Amar. So Vayomer, so this is just a Vav consecutive imperfect 3ms cal. The subject here is the Lord said, and the Lord said, and then he's asking a question here. And so he has a interrogative, hey, and then it's followed by a hifil, and this is from the root yatav. Let me note that. Yatav, and that is a hifil infinitive absolute. And so it'd be an infinitive absolute. And the infinitive absolute is saying something like, is it well, is it doing well? And then we have chara, which we saw earlier. He was very angry back in verse 1. And so it's the same verb, chara, and actually you see the lexical form right here. It is a Cal Perfect 3MS. It means it is hot or he is angry. And so God is asking, is it well, or is it doing well, or literally, doing well, that it is hot to you, or that you are angry? And so we would translate that probably something like, are you doing well to be angry? Which is a key question, obviously, and one that Jonah has to wrestle with. Okay, so that's the end of verses 1 through 4. In the next installment, we'll try to finish out the rest of the book.